So I'm a National Geographic photographer. And usually when I tell people that, the next thing I hear is, oh, so you photograph wild animals. Lions, tigers, right? Well, I photograph my cats quite often, but really for my work, I photograph people. Specifically, I photograph culture all over the world, from farmers in the drought-stricken outback of Australia, to cave-dwelling tribes in Papua New Guinea, to culture right around the corner from us, the Jersey Shore, right? We all know there's a lot of culture there. I probably didn't need to include the second slide of Jersey, but I don't have a screen this big at home. Yeah. Anyway, so like I said, I've been photographing people and culture all over the world for half my life, about 20 years. And it doesn't make me an expert, but I do know how to appreciate and celebrate culture. And I'm here to tell you that we're on the verge of losing a great culture forever. And this isn't just a culture. This is the oldest, longest running culture on our planet. When the pyramids were being built, this culture had been running along for about 55,000 years. So I'm going to start with Lily, because my journey into Aboriginal homelands began with Lily. I was actually just finishing up another assignment for Geographic, a totally different one, and my travels took me through Lily's community, in a remote community, Aboriginal in Western Australia. And I wanted to get a piece of Aboriginal art to bring home. So I was led to Lily, whose work like this has been exhibited all over the world. And she started to tell me about her life. And this is Jack, her husband, next to her. And she started to tell me about both their lives and how, as children, these two grew up naked and in the bush. They had a nomadic lifestyle as children. And she started to tell me about how they had this lifestyle until World War II pulled them out and thrusted them into a modern, colonized Australia. And then she started to talk to me about her country. So when Aboriginal Australians talk about their country, they aren't talking about their nation of Australia, right? They're actually talking about the very land that they are from, that they are of, that they are connected to. And she also started to explain how everything on her country, the rocks, the birds, the trees, everything, even the sandflies that bite really hard, were her family. That she was connected to them. And it's all intertwined. So as Americans, these connections, right, we read about them in New Agey magazines for the most part. Or maybe we schedule a year or schedule a week every year to try to go make these connections. But for Aboriginal Australians, this is part of their, just part of their daily lives. It's actually the very structure of their culture. So as Lily's explaining this stuff, all these cultural connections, it's important to understand, again, how long Aboriginal culture has been around. Scientists believe that they've been around for at least 60,000 years. The last 2 centuries of that time have brought about more change than ever with colonization. Albeit kind of slow in some areas, because Australia is this huge, vast, remote place. So it didn't hit everybody at once, right? Like Lily and Jack, because of World War II. And as a matter of fact, the last hunter-gatherer group was escorted out of the Gibson Desert in the center of Australia and brought into the town of Alice Springs just in 1984. That's how recent their connection to the land in a hunter-gatherer style is. Still, that means that this culture went along pretty much uninterrupted for some 59,000 years. And I realized, sitting there with Jack and Lily, that they were bridges between 2 alien worlds. This life before colonization and this life after. And the interesting thing is that when Lily talked about that life before World War II, she had this glimmer in her eyes. And it was about that connection to her country. And I wanted to know where I could find that in Aboriginal Australia today, because it was so contrary to the prevalent narrative that I was hearing everywhere about this downtrodden Indigenous group in Australia. Because I had already worked on 2 other stories at great length in Australia, so I'd been hearing about this Indigenous group, but I didn't really know them. Don't get me wrong, it's a really sad history, 200 years plus over of dispossession. There's stolen land, there's massacres, there's government policies that controlled where they worked, who they married, their movement. They even took their children away. The Australian government had a policy that allowed them to go into Aboriginal homes and take their children. And they were raised in white foster homes, missionaries, orphanages. And they're known today as the stolen generation. After 2 centuries of dispossession, the Indigenous population in Australia today has the highest rate of cancer, kidney disease, and on average, they died 10 years earlier than their white Australian counterparts. They have a 16% unemployment rate compared to 5% for non-Indigenous Australians. And they make up just under 3% of the general population, but a third of the prison population. So after meeting Jack and Lily and starting to learn about these connections to country, I got really curious. And I proposed a story to National Geographic magazine, and they accepted. And my 4-year journey through Aboriginal Australia began. And I immediately started to look to these remote areas. And I learned about the homelands movement. In the 1970s, there was a more liberal Australian government than what you got today. And they supported people to go back to these ancestral lands, back to these homelands, and revive these connections. There's a well-known Aboriginal elder, Rosalie Cunneth Monks, and she describes homelands as this. Homelands for the Aboriginal person is absolutely your being. It's where you have been for thousands of years. Dispossess the person from that, and they become nothing. So I started to spend a lot of time on these homelands. This is Bottomville on her homelands, managing her land with fire, just as our ancestors have for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. A 10-year study by the Australian Journal of Medicine found that people that had a connection and lived on their homelands lived longer. People who spend time on their homelands speak their native language, and they practice culture. And they pass down language and culture to younger generations. This is Jolly teaching his grandkids where to get oysters, the best place to get oysters. People spend more time with family on homelands. And kids are less likely to get involved with drugs and alcohol addictions. But here's the thing. Connecting to these homelands and in general allowing Aboriginal Australians agency over their own lives has been an uphill battle ever since Europeans arrived. It was only in 1967 that the Australian government decided to count the Indigenous population in their census. And in 2007, the Australian government suspended their Racial Discrimination Act to enforce a policy that specifically targeted Aboriginals. Basically what this was is, if you were an Aboriginal person, right, and you had welfare assistance, you go into a store to buy your food or whatever, buy your goods, you had a specific list of what you can and what you cannot buy. If you were a white Australian with that same welfare assistance and you go into that same store, you can buy anything you want. And basically what this meant was the Australian government was saying, Aboriginal people are not capable of making adult decisions, and white Australians are capable of it. Amnesty International reports that most Australians have never met an Aboriginal person. The cultural divide is oceans wide. Trying to educate an Indigenous group in a European way doesn't always work very well. Only 37% graduate from high school. This principal showed me how she had to go around in this community from house to house and collect each kid to bring them to school. Otherwise, she said, no one would attend. And this teacher told me how she cried herself to sleep almost every night because she was so frustrated that she wasn't able to get through to these kids with the mandated curriculum she had. A lot of you probably can't see because you can't see the screen very well at the bottom, but in the bottom left there's a little boy, his name is Maddie. And here he is completely disconnected from this classroom. And if you can't see him, you can trust it because a lot of these kids are pretty disconnected. Here's Maddie again, completely connected to his cultural education, learning to manage land with fire, just as his ancestors have for tens of thousands of years. So, as I made my way through this journey through Aboriginal Australia, I started to see a lot of these moments from disconnect to connect. And I started to realize that maybe my job as a photojournalist, as a storyteller, wasn't to document how disconnected this culture was, but to document ways in which they were connected to these homelands and how important it is to the future health of these communities and the future generations. I was invited to document a bones repatriation. And interestingly enough, it looped me back to National Geographic because it turns out that in 1948, National Geographic Society teamed up with the Smithsonian Institute and a bunch of other institutions. And they had a group expedition and they went into this area of Aboriginal Australia known as Arnhem Land. And they took all sorts of things, all those things that those expeditions in that era took. They took flora and fauna and art, and they took human skulls. And as part of a global trend, the Smithsonian decided to return these human skulls. And the descendants of these skulls decided to honor this ancestral homecoming with a traditional log coffin ceremony. And the interesting thing is this community had not done this ceremony for some 30 years. And just to give you in its most basic, simplest terms what a log coffin ceremony is, basically you bury the deceased and you leave their body in the ground until just bones remain. Meanwhile, you go find a tree hollowed out by termites on that deceased person's country, that same country that Lily was talking about. And you strip the bark off, and then you paint the story of that person on that log. All of those designs you see on there, that's what Lily was talking about with what her family was. This is that person's family. And then what you do is you exhume those bones, and you put the bones in the hollowed out part of the tree. And then you stand that tree with the person in it back out in their country, and you let them go back to their country. And they will remain there forever. So the day of the repatriation, there was a number of ceremonies, and one of them was private. It was for men only. And the community asked me to document it. And I said, sure. And they're like, no, this isn't for your magazine. This is just for us. You can't show it to anybody. We want a visual record of this ceremony that will add to the knowledge that we have of this ceremony so that future generations have this to build from, to continue this ceremony. So I documented it, and I can't show it to you. I'm forbidden to even explain it. But here's the thing. I hope that that visual record that they have, I mean, hopefully in 30 years they'll know what a DVD is, right? They'll be able to read it. This will help them, it'll just add to their knowledge. What I'm more worried about is will they have the land to do it on? Because this culture does not exist without the land, just as much as it doesn't exist without the people. You can't do a ceremony like this in the suburbs of Sydney or anywhere else, but that exact land that that person is from. It's very important. The problem is that these homelands are under threat right now in a critical way. Tony Abbott, the current Prime Minister of Australia, just this last month publicly supported the closure of over 100 of these homelands. And he punctuated his support with a comment. He said, "The Australian taxpayer cannot afford to pay for people's lifestyle choices of living out in these remote lands." And his remarks have sparked a national debate. It's revived a national debate about whether or not Australia will support this vital connection to country. And ultimately, will it support this culture, this ancient culture? Along this journey, I met this young woman. She was incredible. She was a young Aboriginal woman, dynamic. She was a dancer. And we're having all these conversations about, politics and this history and culture. And she summed up our conversation with a question that's really stuck with me. She said, "I just don't know why our culture isn't treated like a frickin' national treasure." So what do we do? I mean, like I said at the beginning of this, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an economist. But you know what? As a visual storyteller, as a photojournalist, it is my job to call an alarm. And maybe in this situation, the best thing that I can do is to pose Rosie's question. Again, why isn't this culture treated like a freaking national treasure? Why isn't it treated like a world treasure? So recently I was reading National Geographic magazine. You know, those squiggly words and text that go nicely around the pictures to frame them in. There's some content in there to read. I just figured that out recently. And I learned about this conservation technique that marine biologists were using, or are using. And it's called a no-take zone. And they take a reef in the ocean that's under threat, that needs help. And they section off a part of it, just a part of it, not the whole thing, just a part. And they protect it completely from any extracting. Nobody can fish on it, nobody can take anything. And they just let it do its thing. And what happens is amazing. It's expected that this part comes back, right? But actually the whole reef thrives from this section being protected. So what if we took this notion of sanctuary and applied it to these Aboriginal homelands? What if in these areas where people live longer, they speak their native language, they practice their culture and allow their culture to evolve and change and grow? What if we protected these areas and allowed this vital connection to country to remain intact? What if we didn't watch the oldest, longest running culture on Earth extinguish? Thank you very much.